Welcome to a journey through the night, where legends and reality intertwine like red threads between the deep forest and the moonlight. Today's topic is the myth of werewolves and vampires in history. Where did they originate and were they real? A story not just to listen to, but to live with, to feel every breath of the night and the heartbeat of the forest. We will step into the mysterious pages of history, where the silhouettes of those in the form of beasts mingle with the bloodthirsty immortals, following the faint traces in the mist and the echoing calls from deep within human memory. There are no dry academic explanations, but only fragments of ancient memories passed down through generations, like lullabies for night watchmen. Let yourself be immersed in the sound of the wind through the leaves, the distant sound of bells, and let your imagination guide you. Because where the forest and the night meet, truth and legend are only a blink of an eye apart. Crescent Moon. The night was woven like a dark carpet, the wind passing through the pine forest murmuring like the voices of those who had slept for a long time. An old star opened its eyes and looked down, shining on the gray-tiled roof of an ancient monastery. In the moss-covered brick courtyard, the lamp-keeper patrolled, his cloak rustling against the stone like bat wings. He stopped at the dry well, where a worn inscription was carved on the mouth, and placed his hand on the cold stone edge. From the bottom came the distant sound of water, like a whisper. Listen to the story of blood and fur, of fangs and claws, the story that has passed through the centuries like mist passing over the mountainside. And so the story unfolded, flowing like black ink across the pages of the night. Once upon a time greater than any other, when the moons were as large as shields hanging over the world, there was a village in the middle of a dense forest, which the ancients called the Forest of Change. The village was built of pine and mountain stone, and each roof was tied with fragrant grass to ward off evil spirits. When the moon was full, the old people pulled the door latches with silver strings, and the children had wormwood water smeared on their foreheads. No one was born afraid, but everyone learned to be afraid, like learning to tie shoelaces. They did not name the person they feared, they only said, "Tonight, the forest will move." On the edge of the village, there was a blacksmith named Arbin, whose hands smelled of ash and steel. His eyes were bright, black, deep as a well with water. Every night Arbin listened to the sound of chiseling in silence, the sound of red-hot metal placed on the anvil, the sound of hammers like the heartbeat of the earth. Fire and iron taught Arbin that everything has a form and a will. He forged knives for hunters, horse hooks for caravans, and sometimes, late at night, strange hooks to tie to wrists, saying they were for the gamekeeper. He did not ask. He only saw that the hooks were carved with lines like tree roots, and a crescent moon mark. One evening, a woman in a red scarf came to the forge. She placed on the table a leather bag full of old silver coins. So silver that one could not see a face. She spoke in a low voice, as if afraid to wake something sleeping in the wall. "Forge me a necklace, fastened with a silver pin, so tight that nothing can break it. I need it to remember who I am at night." Arbin saw, in her eyes, 2 streaks of moonlight. She did not blink for long, people only blink when they need to hide tears. Arbin forged all night. When the dawn streamed into the furnace like a thin stream of honey, the necklace was ready. She put it on, locked it, and said, "If you hear the wolf cry in the forest like a woman's lament, do not run after it. For when you chase the cry, it will come back and chase you." With that she went away, leaving on the table a long grey hair, thin as silk, but sharp as steel. Arban tried to touch it, and his fingertip bled as if cut by paper. The next night, the full moon rose, so large and close that he thought he could touch it, and the forest began to move. The grass rustled like armor, the leaves ground their teeth. There was a hollow in the heart of the forest, where people used to bury things they did not dare to take home: teeth, hair, names. In that hollow, a howl arose, long and drawn out, like a thread being pulled so hard that it broke. Hunters tied silver strings, but the silver shook, like human hands shaking. Old people recited old rhymes, but the rhymes broke, like strings breaking in the middle of a sentence. Arban stood on the edge of the forest, hearing the sound of claws scratching the bark, the smell of rain-soaked fur, the smell of deeply trampled earth, the smell of fear in shape, like mottled leaves. The changeling never changes completely, the human skin is still there, somewhere, like a shirt hanging behind a door. He only borrows the skin of the beast that is already lurking in his eyes, in his bones. And he runs on all fours, still remembering how to stand upright. That night, in the forest of changelings, there were mixed footprints: human feet pressed against the warm earth, animal feet smeared with mist. Arban saw under a pine tree 4 gray-black hairs, and a silver necklace fell there, dark with blood. Legend has it that before writing, there were traces. People learned to read them as they learned to read words: teeth on bones, nails on wood, blood on snow. And one night, while the villagers were still hiding behind their bolts, a traveler came, in an earth-colored cloak, carrying a stick with a bronze claw at the end. He passed through the village without knocking, walking like one who knew the way, stopping at Arban's forge. "They say you can forge a necklace of memories here," the traveler said, his eyes dark with resin. "I need something else, a small mirror that does not reflect faces." Arban smiled as one smiles when one hears something so absurd that it can be true. "All mirrors reflect." He said. "No," the traveler replied. "There are mirrors that reflect only what one wishes to hide. There are men who, standing before them, cannot see their own faces, because they have hidden their faces in other forms." Arban forged a mirror of dull steel, polished so that it did not shine, so that whoever looked into it would be like a mist. The traveler looked into it, and Arban looked too. There was no one in the mirror, but 2 pairs of eyes flashed like wet stone, a row of long teeth grew like a valley of sharp stones, and a red drop fell like a shooting star. The traveler folded the mirror, as if folding a letter that should not be read. "Someone is looking for you," the traveler said softly. "Someone asked you to lock her neck so she would not forget." When the necklace fell off, she forgot. And when she forgot, she was hungry. Hungry like winter hunger for fire. In the mountains farther away, where thunder sleeps in the belly of rocks and crows learn to speak in the tones of monks, there is another story that goes on its feet, the story of those who like to count the heartbeats of people. They do not run on 4 legs, they glide like candle shadows. They do not howl, they whisper like silk. They do not leave hoof prints, they leave the scent of withered flowers. They are called by many names, but each name means night. Once, in a city with high walls and iron gates, in a black canal, people found a small wooden boat. There was no one on board, only a bunch of wilted white flowers, a veil, and a lock of black hair tied with a red thread. In that city, there was an old pharmacy, with blue glass bottles hanging in the windows. The old woman who owned the shop, her eyes as nearsighted as two heavy drops of glass, sold medicine to the sick, and lullabies to the sleepless. She said that there were people who could not look in the mirror because the mirror was afraid of remembering them. That there are eyes that crave to see the pulse, the wrist, the hollow of the neck, the belly under the ear. She said this not to frighten the young, but to make them remember to bolt the door with a clove of garlic, not because garlic is magical, but because the arm that raises the bolt is the arm that saves itself. One night, the back door of the pharmacy opened. And a shadowless woman entered. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that covered her forehead and eyes, leaving only her lips as pale as wax. She bought an amber bottle, without a label. The old woman looked into the space beside her, where the shadow should have been. "We don't sell those bottles to shadowless people," she said slowly. The woman looked up, her eyes like two drops of ink falling into water. "I'm not shadowless," she whispered, "it's just my shadow that goes first to test the night." The old woman sighed, placing the bottle on the counter. There was a winter so long, one thought one had forgotten how to call summer. The river was frozen, fish slept like glazed eyes, children threw stones on the ice as if to beat the rhythm of a silent song. That season, Arban left the village, following the traveler to the city with high walls. He passed fishing villages with nets hanging like the skin of the sky, through black corn fields waiting for fire, past a cross where a crow held a thread in its mouth. Sometimes, Arban saw a long gray hair in the wind, sometimes, he heard the silk shirt whispering on his back even though he was only wearing a wool shirt. Perhaps the stories were searching for each other, like two rivers looking for a meeting point to become a larger river. When he entered the city, Arban brought with him the blurred mirror the traveler left behind. He hid it in his coat, but it felt like he was carrying a small piece of the night with him. The city smelled of scrap iron, bread, and snow. On a brick wall, there were handprints as thin as tree branches, as if someone had climbed up in the night too quickly to wipe the chalk off his fingertips. Arban ate bread, drank fire wine, and listened to stories that fell onto the wooden table from the troubadour's mouth, stories about a sleepless nobleman who walked on the roofs like the steps of a harp, stories about wolves crossing the square in broad daylight without seeing the sun. The troubadour played a tune, the strings of his harp trembling like a thread hanging from a heart. He told of a rendezvous, on the last night of a long winter, on the old bell tower, when the bell struck 12 times like 12 drops of blood, two people would meet, one of the fur and one of the teeth. Not to kill each other, but to reflect each other, as two waters reflect the sky. For each carried half the question, "Where did you come from? And is it true?" The last night of winter came, the sky like a dark cloak set on fire by someone, burning into stars. The bell tower stood like a forefinger pointing to things unsaid. Arban climbed the spiral stairs, each step dusty as time ground. At the top, the wind blew like a stretched silk ribbon. When the bell struck the first stroke, a gray shadow slid across the roof tiles, roaring softly like metal rubbing stone, a body part human, part beast, eyes remembering the paths of the forest and the mist. When the bell struck the second stroke, a black shadow stood at the edge of the tower, a long cloak like a strip of night, hair like dry night, lips pale like a tired moon. They looked at each other, saying nothing. What needed to be said had been said by smell, by breath, by nights no one knew. Arban stood between them, like a needle between two poles. He pulled out a frosted mirror. "Look," he said, but his voice was only wind on tiles. The gray shadow tilted its head, its fur bristling with the rhythm of the bell. She, if it was she of the necklace, went around the mirror like a wolf around a trap, cautious and curious. The shadow smiled with its eyes, not with its lips. He, if it was he of the amber jars, reached out a waxen hand, touching the edge of the mirror. On the dull steel surface, there was no face. But there were two shapes, a dense forest, an empty castle, a pack. A shadowless room, a long howl, a breathless breath. And in the middle, there was a path as thin as a red thread. The bell struck the 12th. The wind stirred the hair and fur. Far away, the wind carried the scent of garlic, silver, candle wax, and burning pine. Arban understood that the mirror did not answer, but only returned the lost question, placing it between the two so that they could hear it for themselves. The gray shadow scratched lightly on the stone, leaving 4 lines like 4 letters. The black shadow placed a white flower beside it, which trembled like a cold insect. They did not bite each other. They retreated by 2 different ways of the tower, one through the wind, the other through the darkness. Arban watched, and his heart thought, but did not say it, that perhaps these people were born where people put fear. When people name a fear long enough, the stone grows hair, the wax grows teeth. But he did not say it out loud, because words lose the cloak of night. After that night, Arban followed 2 tracks, like 2 lines written in 2 different inks. The track of the hair led him down the icy slope, into a lonely patch of forest between the city and the river. There was an old ash tree, its trunk hollow like a muted wooden trumpet. In the hollow of its trunk, the scent of human skin and the scent of wild animals mingled like 2 voices singing into one. There was another silver necklace, not fallen but placed carefully, as if someone had taken it off in a moment of great lucidity. Beside it were a few long, black hairs that did not belong to a wolf. The other track, the track of a silk shirt, led him past elegant roofs, to a room with a mirror covered with a sheet. A lace bed, a window with thick curtains, where the scent of white flowers was absent. At the threshold, a row of small beads like buttons fell to the floor, not pearls, but the frozen drops of something that had once been warm. Arban knelt beside the ash tree, touched the silver bracelet. His fingers burned, as if the skin had its own memory. He put the ring back in its place, as if answering a question to the place where it lay. Then he went to the shadowless room and knocked. No one answered. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaned like an old voice. On the bed was a night-colored dress, well sewn, with only 1 button missing. On the table was an empty amber vase. Arban opened the cloth on the mirror. In the mirror there was only the room. No one looking. But in the corner of the mirror he saw a faint trace like an old breath. "I do not hunt," Arben whispered to the empty room. I only seek lullabies. And as if in response, a red thread rolled out from under the cupboard, old and strong, tied at both ends like an oath. It is said that once upon a time, when the world was young and the names of the stars were still being tried out, a pair of twins were lost in the night. One grew up in a herd of animals, learned to listen to the sound of water, learned to run parallel to the wind, learned to call the moon mother. The other grew up in a castle, learned to sleep during the day and walk at night, learned to listen to the sound of the heart as if it were music, learned to call the night home. From then on, every time the moon was full, every time the candle ran out, they sought each other out, not to become one, but to remember that they were two. And those in the middle, the blacksmiths, the apothecaries, the night watchmen, were the ones who wrapped their stories in small objects, necklaces, frosted mirrors, amber flasks, cloves of garlic, buttons. One night, Arben returned to the ancient monastery where the story had begun to rise in the well. The long, stone corridor exuded a chill as if remembering the rain that had been absent. The lamp-keeper placed the wick in the oil bowl, and the fire flared up like an open eye. Arben asked to borrow the study, opened an old parchment, not to read the words, for there were no words, but to read the marks. Nail marks, teeth marks, hand marks, stitches. On the skin, two parallel lines flowed like two rivers that did not want to flood, and between them, a bridge drawn with a single stroke. The stroke was so thin that it seemed non-existent, but that was why no one could break it. Someone asked, "Are they real?" Said an old monk, his voice dry as a leaf. He who asked that heard them pass but did not look directly at them. Arben bowed his head. The monk placed a small wooden box before him, inside which was a black button and a white tooth. The real one is the one who keeps it, the monk said, and in his eyes there was a small area of light like a snowflake melting in his hand. Spring crept into the city like a guest who did not knock on the door, leaving a trail of young grass between the bricks. For several nights in a row, on the riverbank, people heard a song so soft that it was mistaken for the sound of water. Arben followed the song and saw a wooden boat painted black, with a red thread tied to the bow. On the boat, a young woman slept, her face as gentle as the night of forgiveness. She wore a small string around her neck, with a black button hanging from it. At the corner of her lips, a thin red line was like an unspoken word. Arben did not touch it, he just sat on the bank, watching so that the boat would not crash. When dawn shone on the water, the young woman opened her eyes the color of chestnut shells. She looked at Arben as if looking at someone who had been watching over her for a long time. "It is time to return the item," she said, her voice like the sound of a flag when the wind is just right. She untied the button and placed it in Arben's hand. "If you meet the man of the night, say that I have kept my word. If you meet the man of the forest, say that I did not follow the cry." Arben nodded, but his heart suddenly felt as heavy as a hammer when his hands were tired. Keeping one's word was the heaviest task for a living man. Rumors travel as fast and as silently as birds. In a swampy area, wolves are seen standing around an open grave, not howling, just sniffing. In another hamlet, a house is always lit even during the day, but when you knock on the door, you only hear the light touch of mirrors like rain on metal. The storyteller adds salt to his words, the wine seller adds water to his cups, the stories swell and contract like lungs. Arban walks through them as if through a hedge, holding a wooden box containing buttons and teeth. He stops in a field where flowers grow at night that smell of iron. There he meets the traveler who came to the forge that day. His eyes are old, but his bronze stick is still new. As if time has not polished that strange metal, what are you looking for? The traveler asks, a bridge, Arban replies, for what? To cross. The traveler nods, pointing to a path in the field, where the grass does not grow because someone is still walking. The road between two nights is not long, he said, but it takes years to know it exists. Arban stepped onto the road, and found that beneath his feet was not earth but a surface as smooth as a mirror, yet as warm as the back of an animal. On that surface his footprints appeared and then faded away, as if unwilling to become evidence. The path led to another edge of the forest, where the trees spoke less, the leaves did not rustle but were as silent as a secret keeper. There, Arban saw her, the woman in red, sitting against a tree trunk, her eyes closed, breathing as if asleep. The silver necklace lay open in her lap. Beside her were traces of a bloodless struggle, drifting grass, collapsed earth, newly peeled bark. Arban sat down, placing the black button on the necklace, as if connecting two objects that had once been a link. She opened her eyes, and in them there was the path of the wolf and the path of the man, two paths that did not need to be chosen, only known. I was hungry, she said, not asking for forgiveness, nor asking for explanation. But I remembered. And when I remembered, I could pass by the cry without falling into it. Arban nodded, handing her the wooden box. She took the white tooth, placed it in her palm, and looked at it as if it were a stone picked up from the river of her childhood. Give that man back the black button, she said. Tell him that the night has learned to compare shoulders with the forest. The next night, Arban came to the shadowless room, carrying the button. The door was still unlocked. There was a shadow in the room, sitting before a mirror covered with a cloth. It was a shadow like vapor, but this time there was a shadow. Arban put the button on the table. Something belongs to you, he said, speaking just loud enough not to break a thin glass. The shadow turned, a young man but ancient, his face as handsome as a knife sharpened too long. He took the button, and sewed it to his shirt with red thread. When he finished sewing, he stood up, and the shadow followed him like one who had caught up. The button is the excuse, he said. The word is the thread. Arban looked at him as if he were looking at a new line on his skin. It is time for you to pay something else, he said. A lullaby. He smiled, the smile did not meet his eyes. But he sang, low as old wine, high as thin metal struck together. It was a lullaby without children, lullaby for things that cannot sleep, the night watchman, the forester, the house-sitter. He sang of putting his teeth in the bowl, his hoofs in the moss, of putting his fur coat on the peg, of putting his night coat in the cupboard, to go out in the morning like a normal person, buy bread, pay with bright copper, smile at the shopkeeper and not lose blood or lose his appearance. When he finished, the room was so quiet that you could hear a drop of wax fall. Arban nodded. And for the first time, he looked into the mirror without covering it. In it he saw his face, covered with sweat and smoke, streaked with ash, streaked with dew. Behind him, there was a forest edge and a window, a bundle of gray fur and a black veil. But everyone stood still, as if they had understood that it was the same night, only the pronunciation was different. The story does not ask whether it is true or not. The story just goes. When people sleep, the story opens the window, lets in the wind, covers the blanket, removes the thorns from the eyes. Outside, the forest still moves slowly, the night still glides gently. There are people who learn to hang silver necklaces not to chain, but to remember. There are people who learn to close the mirror curtains not out of fear, but out of respect for the night as a guest. Small objects, buttons, teeth, mirrors, bracelets, become relics of memory. And Arban, the blacksmith, still forges, not only iron, but bridges as thin as red thread, built between seemingly opposite things so that people can pass without losing themselves. That night, in the monastery, the bell rang 3 times like the heartbeat of a child who has not yet learned to fear. The dry well rang softly, continuing its story to the moss and the rocks. And somewhere, far away but close by, a long howl and a breathless breath stopped together, like 2 hands placed together in the darkness, not clasping, just touching. The spring wind, carrying the scent of wet bark and fresh bread, passed through the stone alleys like a cat that did not want anyone to know its footsteps. In the monastery, Arban wrapped the opaque mirror in linen and placed it next to the wooden box containing buttons and teeth. He stood for a long time at the narrow window, watching the green river slithering through the hearth, remembering the song as small as the sound of water. His hands still smelled of the stove, but in his chest the hammering had quieted, giving way to another beat, as thin as a red thread connecting the 2 banks that continued to separate and then find each other again. The night rested gently on the sloping roofs, and the story went out of the walls, looking for old paths. The lamp keeper nodded to his own shadow, like someone making an appointment with an old friend, and the lamp lit up slightly, enough for the eyes to get used to the darkness. The wind's message came early, in the east, behind the green mountains, arranged like fish scales. There was a vast meadow where horses slept standing up, where men tied their hair with leather thongs and told stories on their backs. There the ancients spoke of those who wore wolfskins as a guard of honor. They did not hide from the forest hid from them. And in the far north, through the cold pine forests and the smoky wooden villages, the ancients spoke of night theaters, closed-curtained rooms where strings sounded as thin as the tendons of the neck, where glass kissed the lips without leaving a breath. 2 calls to each other were like 2 sirens answering in the mist. Arban carried a mirror, a box, and a red string that he had spun himself from scraps of wool and ashes. He left the city before dawn. Someone had hung a bunch of garlic in a window, someone else had pinned a silver button to a child's scarf. He went east. The first road led through a rocky glade, where there were bare, knee-high lumps of earth. Here he met a group of men riding low, with sunburned skin and eyes as sharp as needles. They smiled with white teeth, tapped their horses' knees, and asked in a long whistle, "Are you looking for the name of the night, or the name of the forest?" Arban replied, looking for the 2 old names, to put them back in their places. The leader of the group, an old woman with braided hair that reached down to her horse's back, nodded, and handed him a small leather bag. "Here is the hair of the old leader of the pack, not for killing, but for remembering the scent of the pack," she said. "Put it in the heart of your coat when you run through the pastures of your ancestors." Arban wore the hair inside his coat. It smelled like rain on ashes, the night rested gently on the sloping roofs, and the story went out of the walls, looking for old paths. The lamp keeper nodded to his own shadow, like someone making an appointment with an old friend, and the lamp fell. The grasslands opened up like a roll of silk without edges. There, the ancients told a story that writing could not keep up with, that there was a child born with open eyes, looking at the moon without blinking. When the child grew up, he wore animal skins on winter nights to keep warm, then forgot to take them off when the rooster crowed. From then on, he learned two ways of living, one with the herd, one with the kitchen. Every time the hunting season came, he taught people to kneel down and touch their foreheads to the ground before following the trail, so that the ground would know the face of the one who would leave it. And every time the rice season came, he taught people to hang animal skins on tall trees, so that the wind would learn the person's name. People called this the origin of the change of form, not a curse, but a lesson repeated so often that whoever forgot was reminded by the night. The night in the grasslands smelled of mare's milk and clean sweat. Arban sat with the storytellers who did not look at the listener, their mouths turned to the sky like men turning their faces when crying. They said, their voices hoarse from the wind rubbing their necks, "One day, the wolf pack and the human pack were traveling the same path. Neither of them backed away. The child with open eyes stepped forward, took the animal skin off his shoulder, and placed it between the two packs. The wolf sniffed. The human looked. Then they both circled around, like water around a stone. Arban understood, there were answers that were not yes or no, but go through. At the end of the night, they gave Arban a small drum covered in leather, with a crescent moon painted on it. "Bell when you get lost," they instructed. "But be slow, the fast sound calls for hunger." Across the meadow was a red ridge of rock like the roofs of a herd of animals sleeping together. There, Arban encountered rocks standing tall like watchmen who had forgotten to change their songs for 1,000 years. Below, a river cut the hill like a knife. On the shore, there was a cave cool as the throat of the earth. Inside the cave, on the wall, were charcoal and clay figures, human bodies with animal heads, animals with human eyes, hands intertwined with claws, herds running in a whirlpool. An old cave keeper, his beard braided into 2 strings, opened a cloth bag and took out a stone tooth, not an animal tooth, but a tooth that had been sharpened into a half-moon shape by a human. When people were drawing with smoke, they knew how to put teeth on the wall, he said. Not to scare them, to remind them that teeth were once as soft as gums. Arban placed the white tooth in a wooden box next to the stone tooth, hearing the two things tap lightly like 2 raindrops touching each other. The old man nodded, like a wall nodding. "Take this lime with you," he said, handing him a piece of cave chalk. "Don't write. Draw a line across every time the night gets too long. In the morning, count the lines. If there are too many, sleep more. If there are not enough, go on. The next street led Arban through a large market where fabrics chirped like birds and spices evaporated into color. In the row of counters hidden from the sun, a stall selling black glasses was looming. The owner was a woman with braided hair like a fishnet, her eyes sparkling like two pieces of broken glass. On the shelves were small mirrors shaped like drops, spears, leaves, all were blurred, as if they had seen too many faces and were tired. She said, her voice like a chiseled glass, "There are peoples who believe that mirrors do not reflect blood, but only memories. Therefore, those who drink too much memory cannot see." Arban placed her blurred mirror on the counter. She tilted her head, "This mirror has learned to speak less." "Good." She opened a drawer and took out a thin ash-colored curtain. "Don't cover the mirror to cover it. Cover it so that it can sleep. Things need sleep, or else they will dream instead of people." Arban paid in bright copper. She also gave him a silver hairpin, the tip of which was shaped like a garlic leaf. "For nights when I'm afraid to speak frankly," she said. This hairpin didn't stab anyone, it just pinned the lapel in the right place. At the end of the market was a stone gate leading down a flight of steps into the belly of the city. Arban heard the sound of water, not a river, but a low-pitched laughter of underground currents. The underground room was arranged like a chapel, vaulted walls, slow-moving oil lamps. In the middle, a long table was set with thin glasses. A man in black, his wrists bound with red thread, his movements as light as ink falling into water, stood waiting. He looked at Arban as if he were measuring the breakage of a glass with his eyes. "On time," he said, his voice low, holding his breath like a harpist. "Come to return it," Arban replied, placing the black button on the table. The man picked it up. "Neither happy nor sorry. Buttons only keep clothes," he said. "What keeps the night is words. But thank you." He invited Arban to sit, pouring a colorless liquid into the cup, fragrant as freshly opened paper. "There are many families in the night," he continued. "Some families like long, drafty corridors, some like glass cabinets and gloves, some like to walk on roofs instead of streets. They all learn one thing, to walk without making a cracking sound." He placed a small box on the table and opened it. Inside was a thin silver ring, its face as smooth as water. "Someone wants to keep me in a circle," he said. "But the ring goes round and round, and does not hold." He handed the ring to Arban. "Bring it to the man of the forest. Tell her that at night she learned not to lock it." Arban took the ring, feeling it as cold as the truth. "You ask about the origin?" The man smiled, this time meeting his eyes. "The origin is in the things that are called forever. When you fear losing your name, you cast it into teeth, into claws, into bat wings, into fur coats. Then at night, that name goes around in your stead." He tilted his head slightly. "Whether it is true or not, that is the work of the mirror, and mirrors sleep, and sometimes they let it slip." When Arban left the cellar, it was raining steadily. The raindrops were straight as strings, weaving a curtain of water between him and the rest of the story. He took shelter under the eaves of a mill. There was a little girl wrapped in a large cloth, holding a basket of white onions. She looked at the rain as if she were looking at flowing words. "Are you afraid of the night?" she asked, not looking at Arban, as if asking the rain. Arban shook his head. "Not afraid. But remember to close the door. My house," she whispered, "hangs onions in front of the door at night. The people in the house sleep well. But if someone passes by, it is still odorless." Arban understood. The shadow had learned to breathe like a house. He handed her a garlic leaf hairpin. "Put it on your scarf," he said. "Don't stab anyone. Remember to come back when you cross the threshold." She put it on, smiling, her baby teeth as pretty as halved onions. Night came, and Arban followed the dark mud path that led to the marsh. There, the reeds were as tall as a man's shoulders, and the frogs' voices were like needles sewing quietly through a cloth of water. He beat the drum once, just once. The sky answered with a silence greater than before. From the shade of the reeds, a pair of round eyes, bright as two wet stones, looked out. A figure as silent as a log of wood flowed, not a wolf, not a man, the middle, the breathing of the earth in winter and summer meeting. She stood before Arban. Her scent was dry fur, bark, and in the distance, the scent of burnt grass. Arban opened the box and took out the silver ring. "The ring is not locked," he said. She bowed her head, letting the ring touch the fur near her neck. It lay there, like a drop of moon that fell without melting. She spoke in a long-practiced voice. "I have passed through many seasons, through many calls. Each call is a string, drawing me back to a flock. But a flock is not a home if I cannot name it." She looked up, her eyes as thin as unpeeled almonds. "You remind me of my name," she said to Arban, and it was neither a compliment nor a gratitude, it was just a sentence. Arban put his hand on her head, his fingers touching a faint scar where the hair had grown in a different direction. He understood, it was not from teeth or nails, but from a very long night. A long night, he thought, must be marked with chalk. They walked together for a while, like two words go in a sentence that did not need to be connected. They came to a strange land. The wind carried the smell of salt, the sand blew through their shoes, the stone pillars rose straight out of the sea like giant flutes of the sky. There were other stories here, of a shadowless night walker standing at noon, eyes unblinking before the sun-baked blade, of a beast-skinned man swimming underwater like a school of silver fish, coming ashore striped like sand. Stories learned each other's accents, changed the way he breathed to stay in this place. Under a stone arch, they met an old knight, his armor covered with salt, his visor on his knee. He dipped his sword in the water, drew it out, and let the water run down his blade like the blood of the sea. "I once chased a shadow," he said without looking at anyone. "I chased it to the edge of the water. The shadow walked on the surface of the waves. I came to my knees. Then the sword was too heavy, I let it go." He laid the sword across his knees, like a large fish carcass for a cat. "From there, I keep watch on the shore," he chuckled, "to watch the shadow pass, and to salute." He handed Arban a strip of faded red cloth. "Tie it where you fear it will fall," he instructed. "Not to hold on to remember where it fell." They turned into an old waterside town, with green stone walls and double windows like human eyes open silently. In the square, a procession moved slowly, holding candles covered with glass shades. Hymns were whispered, blending with the footsteps of night birds. At the head of the line, there was a young priest, his face like unwritten paper. At the end of the line, a woman with braided hair, wearing a string of black beads. She turned to look at Arban, her eyes not angry, not happy, just aware. She approached, her voice thin as a candle about to go out. Lately, the mirrors in my house have been sleeping more. I cover them with a cloth. When I speak to the night, I look at the wall. She put a small wax-covered jar in Arban's hand. It is the scent of dried jasmine, she said. Not to call anyone. To remind that there is a scent that should not be called. Arban gently opened the lid, the scent of jasmine like a promise that was no longer needed. He closed it again, putting it in the pocket opposite the one with the wolf hair. Balance is a profession. Past the citadel was a small desert, like the breath of the earth between two long sentences. White sand, blue sky, thin moon like a child's fingernail. They walked beside a caravan of purple cloth merchants, camels rang their bells, the bells rang the sand. A child in the caravan pointed to the sky. That, he said, is the beast of the stars. In the sky, a constellation drew a curved back, a long tail. The leader nodded. In the old days, when the stars had not yet been named, people pointed to the sky with the image of the beast in their minds to ease their memories. Then they forgot, only the name remained. Arban walked silently, thinking about the name shedding its body and leaving. The werewolf beside him was also silent, his ears moving slightly as the sand sang. That night, they slept under a hot stone that was left. Arban drew a line of chalk on the back of the stone. In the morning, the line faded. He smiled, the night had shortened enough. They came to a city by a black lake, where the houses were made of soaked wood, and the smell of resin was as heavy as oil. The people there told stories with their eyes, because their mouths were busy smoking pipes. In a steam bath, the steam was as thick as mist, and Arban sat next to an old man as big as a baker's oven. He patted his chest and said, "There was someone in my family who drank the blood of grass, and got drunk until he forgot." The grass laughed. The man laughed too. Then there was someone else who drank the blood of a deer, and remembered the deer's path. Then there was someone else who drank the blood of a man, and remembered the door of a man's house, so much so that he couldn't forget to leave. He laughed loudly, and the steam shook like a drum. Don't ask what's real or fake. Ask what you want to remember. Behind the bathhouse, there was a wooden bridge across the lake. The water was as black as closed eyes. In the middle of the bridge, a bell was hung. People passing by touched it lightly, and the bell rang like the sound of teeth gently tapping on a cup. Arban touched it, and heard the sound spread far and wide, touching the uninhabited shores. One night nearby, a starry night, they stopped in a low field, the dandelions not yet blooming. Suddenly the wind brought the smell of freshly struck metal. Arban looked up. In the middle of the field, a makeshift forge had been set up, the bellows blowing rhythmically like a black chest. There, a young woman was forging. Each blow of her hammer on the iron was like a letter. Arben approached. She looked at him, recognized the smell of the old furnace in his clothes, and smiled slightly. "I forge locks that don't close," she said. "Locks to remind you to open them." She handed Arben a thin iron bracelet, engraved with two small words that were too small for the naked eye to read. You had to touch them with your fingers to know, back and go. Arben put the bracelet on his wrist. The bracelet wasn't tight, he chose the right fit. The werewolf tilted her head as if she could hear the hammer echo somewhere in her fur. She closed her eyes, then opened them, both times slowly. The next morning, strange footprints led them to another edge of the forest. This forest did not speak much, the trees did not whisper, the ground was flat like a short greeting. On the ground, circular marks, places where someone had sat for a long time. In the middle of the circle, a black shirt was folded neatly, as if someone had left it for the night to go and bask in the sun for a while. In another circle, a clump of gray hair was scattered like ash, as if someone had combed it. Between two circles, a red thread connected, hanging a small bronze bell, enough for the wind to ring. Arben did not touch it. He only placed the silver ring he had brought for the werewolf near the thread, and hung a small drum on the other side. The werewolf looked at the composition silently, nodding like someone who could read the writing on objects. From deep in the forest, footsteps, light, but many. Pack. No. People. A group of people came out, their eyes were tired, like people who had been up many nights, but their lips were clean. They placed wild flowers in two circles, spoke without a word, and disappeared into the forest like mist. Arben understood, there are places where people and animals take turns, to practice being close without mixing. The night came late, like a guest who came late and the host still waited. Arben and the werewolf sat on the stone steps of a ruined tower, watching the moon sail through the clouds. Arben opened the wooden box, black buttons, white teeth, more rings that had been given, a dim mirror sleeping under the towel, the garlic hairpin no longer in the pocket. He arranged them in the shape of a boat. The werewolf placed on it the hair of an old woman's head, like a sail. From a distance, a dark figure appeared at the edge of the tower, his cloak flowing like water from a basin. He did not approach, but stood as if listening to a song that was beginning. Night and forest, Arben whispered, the same sky. The dark figure nodded, this time seeing. The werewolf put his muzzle on his knees, eyes open, but still. A small bell in some glade rang softly in the wind. All three were like the first three letters of a sentence that was about to be written. Dawn dilutes all boundaries, like water added to strong wine without diluting the meaning. Arben and the werewolf parted at a fork where the earth changed color. She went into the forest, not in a hurry. He headed toward a new valley, where church bells rang the hours with three short chimes, one long one. On the way, he stopped at a wooden house with arched windows, where children hung amulets of dried chestnuts. A young mother ladled porridge into a bowl, touched Arben's arm, and asked with her eyes. Arben nodded, not speaking. She hung another red thread on the door frame. For those who are not used to seeing, she said as if talking to herself, at the end of the valley, an unmarked grave was open. Inside, there was only a neatly folded black cloak and a wilted garlic clove. Someone had placed both of them there like two opposites in the same sentence, to see if they would fight. Arban placed the black button there, not to throw it away, but to borrow space. He whispered to the earth, "Keep it for me, until you need it, the land holds as the land holds." In the afternoon, Arban came to a white wooden library with a fish-scale roof, located in the middle of a birch forest. There were no books in the library, only small boxes, each containing an object, a silver-covered nail, a pinch of garlic dust, a piece of mirror, a strip of veil, a piece of cave coal, a hair. Each object was placed on a white sheet of paper, with a sentence written underneath, not an explanation, just a memory. Rainy night, the bells ring through the reeds. The scent of jasmine calls no one. The moon breaks on the blade of a sword. The librarian was a woman with silver hair, her hands in knitted wool gloves. She opened a compartment, empty. "Here waits for a drum," she said. Arban hung the drum in the compartment, letting the drumstick lie on its side. She smiled. "When someone comes looking for a way home between two calls, they can knock. We do not answer. The forest and the night will return." She handed Arban a blank sheet of paper, placed a charcoal pen on it. "Write a memory of yours," she said. "The bridge is as thin as a thread," Arban wrote, "and people crossing it do not break it because 3 feet, 2 human, 1 animal, are placed in 3 different places at the same time." Night came as promised. On the way back to the monastery, Arban passed a field of barley. The grains nodded, the nods of those who had heard too many stories without getting tired. At the edge of the field, a child took a red string, tied it around his wrist and his mother's wrist, and smiled. The mother looked at the child as if looking for an answer and suddenly entered the house. At the end of the road, the monastery opened its doors. The dry well was silent, as if listening from afar. Arban placed the wooden box on the stone table, covered the bedside mirror with a cloth, hung the bracelet on an old nail, placed the ring he had given to his chest, by placing it in memory, not in an object. The lamp keeper lit the wick. The smoke from the wick was fragrant like a new letter written with the left hand. From afar, very far and very near, came a long howl that did not call for help, and a breathless sigh that did not invite. The 2 sounds were placed lightly on each other like 2 hands warming themselves with silence. On the wall, the lamp keeper's shadow and Arban's shadow lengthened, embraced each other for a moment, then retreated to each side. The story continues, not asking whether it's true or not, because I know I'm the bridge people use to cross every long night. The morning mist was like a thin veil wrapped around the valley, creeping over the stone roof, over the monastery doorframe, over the dry well. Arban woke up when the first bell rang like a drop of mercury falling into a copper bowl. He stepped out into the stone courtyard, inhaling the damp, cold smell of stone and moss, like inhaling the pages of an old, unopened book. By the monastery gate, an old crow stood guard, its yellow eyes like the last sparks of fire in the coals. It tilted its head at Arban, its voice hoarse like a chain. Then it flew away, dropping a small object at his feet, a wooden button, carved with the shape of a crescent moon. The knot seemed to call Arban away from the monastery again. He followed the old stone path, the path where moss had learned to squeeze into the cracks like letters into paper. The path led through a birch forest, the trunks as white as giant bones, the bark mottled like the skin of a sick animal. On the trunks, someone had carved concentric circles, each a different color, charcoal, clay, and dried blood. The smell of blood was faint, but enough to slow the pulse in Arban's wrist. He knew this was the mark of the Ring Society, those who believed that the soul had many layers, like the rings of a tree. They peeled back each layer to find the core, something that did not change shape. That did not need a shadow. Some of the society were said to have disappeared into the forest, leaving their bodies like hanging garments, carrying only the core. Arban found the largest birch tree, where the ring was carved so deeply that it seemed to reach the heart of the tree. There was an old silver ring there, twisted on one side, as if it had been tried to break. Beside the circle, a scrap of paper, written in shaky handwriting, "Tell him not to return to the full moon." The writing stopped abruptly, as if the writer had been called out in the middle of a sentence. Leaving the birches, Arban came to a meadow sloping down to a green lake. The lake was as smooth as glass, but there were no clouds in it, only the reflection of something standing right on the shore, a woman in a black fur coat, holding a bunch of white daisies. As Arban approached, she did not turn around, but her reflection in the water turned. The reflection smiled, but she did not. "Do you bring news from the forest?" she asked, her voice not leaving the lake. "Yes," Arban replied, "and from the night." She put the bouquet in the water, letting it float out to the middle of the lake. "The night and the forest are one family," she said. "Only when men come, do they part." Then she handed Arban a wooden comb, its teeth curved like crescent moons. For when the wind is contrary, to remember the original direction of the hair. When Arban looked down at the water again, her reflection had disappeared, leaving only thin waves like scratches on a mirror. The journey took Arban to a stone tower in the middle of a swamp. To get there, he had to walk on planks that formed a bridge, where the reeds were higher than his head, and the water was as black as unwritten ink. Inside the tower, the wind blew through the narrow cracks like someone's teeth whistling. Dozens of wooden masks hung on the walls, each a half-human, half-animal face, with hollow eyes. An old man guarding the tower said that each mask was for someone who had gone into the forest or at night and never returned. Their relatives made the masks and hung them up, so that if they got lost, their souls would know the way back. "But some people don't want to go back," he laughed dryly. "So the masks stay here until termites call their names." The old man chose a small mask with a nose as long as a snout, and gave it to Arban. "Give this to the next person you meet. If they fit, they have forgotten too much. When you take it off, remember to say to them, 'This is your old face.'" As the purple twilight spread over the reeds, Arban came out of the tower and came across a group of people walking in a line. They wore gray cloaks, and shouldered bags of shells and feathers. The leader was a young girl, her forehead bandaged, her eyes like two pieces of unpolished amber. She took the mask from Arban, put it on her face, and stood still for a moment. When she took it off, there was a faint mark on her forehead, as if she had worn it for a long time. "You brought it from the tower?" she asked. "Yes." She smiled very lightly, like the wind on a reed. Then you also go looking for a home. But remember, home may lie in the very thing you bring to give away. Saying this, she pulled a large shell from her bag and placed it in Arbon's hand. When you put your ear to it, you will hear the sound you fear most. And if you still hear it, it means it has not left you. Arbon tried it. There was only the sound of footsteps in the snow, but the footsteps were not his own. When night fell, Arbon camped beside a rotten tree, hanging the shell near the fire. The crackling of the fire drowned out the fear in the shell, leaving a silence like a windless lake. He slept fitfully, dreaming of a red bridge, on which the werewolf and the shadow stood facing each other, between them a row of objects, a crescent moon wooden button, a wooden comb, a mask, a shell. Each object glowed when the bell rang, and when the bell stopped, all turned into an endless thread, wrapped around the two men and tied to Arbon's wrist. He awoke when dawn was like a silver strip cutting across the pond. And in his hand he found a new red thread, soft, but strong as sinew. At the end of the swampy road, Arbon came to a riverside village, with houses built on stilts on high stilts. Children rowed in small boats like wooden troughs, laughing like the sound of falling seeds. An old woman stood on the porch, her hair as white as the clouds. She saw the red thread in Arbon's hand and signaled. That road, she pointed to the river, flows to where the night and the forest reflect their faces. What is there? Arbon asked. No one stays long. But whoever comes leaves something behind. She handed him a small woven basket, filled with fragrant leaves. Put in it the things you cannot keep. So that when you get there, the water will know. Arbon put the wooden buttons, combs, masks, and shells in the basket. The basket was lighter than he had expected, as if he had learned to float. The boat was as small as a dry leaf, drifting along the silvery river under the full moon. Arbon sat at the bow, his woven basket between his knees. Along both sides, the river banks gradually retreated into darkness, giving way to rows of tall trees leaning down, their leaves touching the water as if to test their own image. The sound of oars clattering mingled with the splashing of fish, each drop of water breaking, carrying the smell of young mud and wet seaweed. At the narrowest part of the river, Arbon saw two strips of land connected by a low-arched stone bridge. There was no one on the bridge, but two different lamps were hung at both ends of the bridge, one with a warm yellow light like a stove fire, the other with a cold white light like the moon reflecting on a knife blade. As his boat drifted into the shadow of the arch, the water beneath his feet suddenly lit up, not because of the moon, but because of countless phosphorescent points rotating like a swarm of eyes opening at the bottom. Coming out of the dome, Arbon saw the river opening into a round lake, the banks of which were smooth black stones that looked as if they had been polished by a giant's hand. In the middle of the lake, there was a small island, and on the island, another bridge, but this bridge did not span the water, but a gap between two large rocks. The gap was so black that one could not see the bottom, and the wind blew from it a smell both of rotten wood and of newly blooming flowers. On the stone bridge, two figures stood waiting. One was gray from the forest, with wet fur on his shoulders, eyes like dark almonds. The other was black from the night, with a long cloak touched by the wind, and skin as white as wax. They did not look at each other, but both looked at Arben's boat. Arben leaned his oar against the rocks, stepped onto the island, his woven basket in his arms. Both figures bowed slightly as if in greeting. He set the basket down in the middle of the bridge, opened the lid. Corks, combs, masks, shells, each one took a last breath. Then the wind from the gap carried them away, so lightly that the fragrant leaves in the basket remained undisturbed. After the basket was empty, the werewolf stepped forward, placing his hand, half fur, half leather, on the basket's lap. The shadow did the same, his hand colder than the water of a lake at the deepest night. Arben saw a new red thread tied around all three wrists, so thin that it was only visible when the moon rose above the clouds. The thread trembled slightly, and in its vibration there was a sound, not words, not music, but the common heartbeat of a pack that had just found itself after being lost for so long. The werewolf took off the silver ring from his neck and placed it on the shadow's hand. The shadow took off another black button and placed it on hers. No one said keep or return. Just hands closing around the object like a finished poem. Arben took off the iron bracelet engraved with the words /go and placed it in the middle of the bridge. They both placed their hands on it, and the bracelet disappeared as if absorbed into stone. The space under the bridge was still black, but the wind blowing from it was warmer. They stood like that until the yellow and white lights at both ends of the bridge went out at the same time. When the last light receded from the rock, all three took a step back. The werewolf and the shadow each took a different path. She disappeared into the woods, he into the mist that covered the lake. Arben stayed on the island, watching the empty bridge. In his basket now was only a single fragrant leaf. He picked it up, smelled it. It was no longer a single scent. It was the scent of dry fur, cold cloth, burnt wood, lake water, and the scent of ashes that had been on his hands since the first day. He put the leaf in his pocket and returned to the dock. As he rowed, the water beneath his feet seemed lighter, and the phosphorescent spots on the oars shone like broken gems. Back on the riverbank, Arben saw a group of children lighting a fire to roast fish. One of them ran over, holding a small leather drum, his own, but the face of the drum had changed. Instead of a crescent moon, it was now a swirl of intersecting roads. "We found it on the bank," he said. "Try it, it sounds like someone is answering." Arben beat a beat. From somewhere in the forest, a deep howl joined the beat. From somewhere on the roof, a soft breath joined the beat. The children laughed, thinking it was a game, but Arben knew it was a greeting. He handed the drum back to the children, so they could continue beating it as long as they were happy. A call, he thought, in the hands of many, will no longer be a chase. That night, Arben returned to the monastery. The lamp-keeper waited in the courtyard, the frosted mirror still sleeping under the blanket, the wooden box still on the stone table. Arben did not add anything to the box, nor did he take anything out. He only placed a new red thread on it, tying it into a loop. The lamp-keeper looked, then nodded, without asking. The two stood together by the dry well. From deep within the stone, a sound came, the sound of water or footsteps. Neither of them inclined their ears, only letting the sound touch them like the wind touching their faces, and somewhere beyond the monastery walls, the forest and the night met again, not to remember, not to forget, only to walk together for a short distance before each went its own way. Autumn mornings came like the breath of a deep sleeper, soft, slow, and carrying the scent of withered leaves and distant kitchen smoke. On the steep roofs around the monastery, dew fell in small drops, settling on the tiles like a flock of eyes silently looking at the sky. Arban left the stone courtyard, carrying fragrant leaves, and walked out onto the red dirt road leading down to the plain. He took his time, as if each step was searching for an old heartbeat still lurking somewhere between the earth and the wind. Along the way, he saw stone pillars standing alone in the empty fields. At the top of each pillar was a narrow slit, large enough to hold a small object. Most of the slits were empty. But only a few pillars remained: a faded silver nail, a hemp rope, a stone painted with a moon. The old people in the area said that each object had once been someone's promise to the night or the forest, and when the wind blew the object away, the promise was considered to have expired. Arban stopped at a vacant pillar, took from his pocket the wooden button engraved with a crescent moon that the old crow had given him. He stuck it in the slit, untied, so that the wind could take it whenever it wanted. For a moment, the stone pillar shook slightly, as if hearing a story whose ending was already known. At the end of the plain, Arban came to a fishing village. The lake breeze carried a faint saltiness, not enough to dry the lips but enough to salt the hair. The boats were moored close together, their sides creaking like old bones in the cold night. An old man rowed a small boat closer to the dock and handed Arban a damp cloth bag. "Someone sent for you," he said. They didn't stay to wait. In the bag was a glass jar filled with dew, real dew, cold and moist as if it had just fallen from the leaves. On the wooden stopper that sealed the jar, a claw mark and a tooth mark intersected, so small that you had to tilt it to the light to see it. Arban held the jar, feeling like he was holding the forest and the night in his arms, but made small enough to carry without fear of getting lost. That night, Arban found a high mound and opened the bottle of dew. The white mist crept out, not rising into the sky but crawling down to the ground, finding its way into the cracks of the rocks like underground water returning home. He heard in the mist a short howl, a shallow sigh, the two merging together, unable to tell the beginning or end. When the mist cleared, a small crack appeared under the rock, and in the crack was a rusty iron box. Arban opened it. Inside was a broken piece of mirror, only as big as a fingernail, but looking into it, he saw intact the faces of all three, she of the forest, and he of the night, standing on a bottomless bridge. The image in the mirror smiled, a smile that promised no future meeting, but did not close the door. Arban closed the box and put it back in the crack. "Here," he whispered, "let the wind keep it." Winter came slowly but surely, like a beast that stalks rather than rushes. On the way back to the monastery, Arban met a group of men in fur cloaks, carrying bundles of bone-white firewood. They stopped by an ash tree, hanging faded red strips of cloth from its branches. One of the men looked at Arban and asked, "Where have you come from?" "From where the forest and the night touch," he replied. The man smiled, revealing strong white teeth. "So you bring me a word?" Arban thought, then said, "The word is, when the moon is full and the wind is favorable, leave the door open for those who are not accustomed to knocking, but place a bowl of water on the threshold. Let anyone who drinks come in. Let anyone who passes by pass by." The man nodded, as if he had heard this word before he was born. When Arban returned to the monastery, the lamp-keeper was sweeping the courtyard, his wooden broom rubbing the stone, making a steady sound like a sleeping heartbeat. On the stone table, the wooden box was still there, the red thread was still there, and the frosted mirror was still sleeping under the cloth. Arban added nothing to it, but placed on the cloth a bright yellow birch leaf, a sign of the season's end. The lamp-keeper looked up, his eyes unquestioning. They both sat by the dry well. No sound came up, only the silence of things done without needing to be closed. Outside the wall, the moon rose, full and bright, but it called to no one. Somewhere, between shadow and fur, between claws and teeth, footsteps were walking side by side, leaving no trace, for there was no need to prove that they had passed. The last night came like the deep breath of someone who had just put down his pen on the table, no rush, no regrets, just slowly letting the ink dry. The sky opened like a black cloth embroidered with stars, each one an eye that had heard the whole story but still pretended to sleep. In the monastery, the dry well was still silent, but the cold air from the stone was now a little warmer, as if water were slowly returning from somewhere. On the stone table, the frosted mirror slept under the cloth, the red thread circle was still round, the wooden box was slightly heavier, though no one had added anything to it. The lamp-keeper hung the last lamp on the archway, its light reaching the edge of darkness. Then stopping, not crossing, like someone who knew the boundary and still smiled, Arban sat on the sill, his eyes looking out at the place where the forest and the night had once met. Faces flashed through his mind, the werewolf's almond eyes, the shadowless smile of the man in black, the old hand that handed over the feather, the sound of a child beating a drum, the scent of dried jasmine that called no one. All like different colored threads, woven into a coil. He knew that he would continue to forge, not only iron, but also thin bridges between seemingly opposites, so that those who passed through would not lose their names. The wind blew through the courtyard, gently shaking the birch leaf on the mirror cloth. No one opened the mirror, but Arban knew that if it did, it would illuminate a path straight to sleep, where howls and sighs melted together like two wisps of smoke meeting in a fire. The night embraced the monastery, and the story closed without a lock, so that anyone who needed it could open it, like opening a window to a sky that was familiar but never ceased to be strange.